Hi, I'm Mike Hudson, Director of the Museum of the American Printing House for the Blind. Welcome to the Redux presentation of sessions from the Hidden Legacies of Helen Keller Symposium, which was held in Louisville, Kentucky on September 17th and 18th, 2022. The symposium, with primary sponsorship from the American Printing House for the Blind and the Filson Historical Society, brought together scholars, writers, and Keller enthusiasts from across North America. In 2020, the American Foundation for the Blind Helen Keller Archive arrived at our museum on 23 pallets. And since then, our staff has been busy cataloging, describing, measuring, and inventorying this most amazing history of one of the most amazing women of the 19th and 20th centuries. I'm sitting in front of her desk from her house at Arcan Ridge. Helen Keller was a writer, activist, advocate, ambassador, and world traveler who profoundly affected the way the world thinks about people with disabilities. And yet, she is little understood, often frozen in time as a little girl with her hand under the water pump behind her parents' home in Tuscumbia, Alabama. Our symposium was just a beginning effort to bring together the most current scholarship in innovative ways to better understand Keller, her companion Anne Sullivan, and her times. We hope you enjoy the series. Each session will be dedicated to a single speaker from the symposium. Our fifth and final session on Saturday afternoon was titled, What Was Access? When Helen Keller first began working for the American Foundation for the Blind, accessible technologies were referred to as tangible apparatus or appliances. Our three presenters explored aspects of the development and impact of assistive technologies and assistive legislation across the 20th and 21st centuries. Our second speaker in that session was Dr. Janelle Legg, Assistant Professor in History at Gallaudet University. Dr. Legg discussed the digital mapping of deaf communities across time. The use of digital tools to explore historical diversity at different scales offers insight on how disability communities lived, learned, and socialized. Data visualization has implications for making many communities more visible, while also creating new challenges for studying and teaching about the past. Janelle Legg completed her PhD in U.S. history at George Mason University, with emphasis in digital and religious histories. Her dissertation, With Eloquent Fingers He Preached, the Protestant Episcopal Mission to the Deaf, explored the development of church services and spaces in the United States between 1850 and World War I. In 2011, she graduated from Gallaudet University with dual master's degrees in deaf studies and deaf history.
Thank you for that introduction, and I'll go ahead and get started. First, I will position myself a little bit. I am a white woman in my late 30s. I'm wearing a red blazer and black shirt. I do also want to position myself as a native signer. I grew up in a signing household. My parents are deaf. I'm hearing and speaking, obviously. And this is an unusual presentation for me. Usually I am using sign language in presentations, so please forgive me for awkward speech patterns. And we'll just go ahead and get started. My presentation is on visualizing deaf spaces. And I'll start with a question for myself. What are deaf spaces? Now, these are places in which deaf people gathered, where they lived, where they worked, where they learned, where they socialized. And these places are permanently or provisionally arranged to suit deaf sensibilities. And I argue that deaf spaces also maintain, shelter, and valorize visual and spatial ways of being. Now, this idea is driven from Hansel Baumann, who is an architect who has looked at this notion of deaf space. And he uses that word as one word, deaf space, those two words combined. And he argues that built environments hold and transmit meaning, that they are embedded with cultural identity, cultural power, and that they reinforce collective and individual well-being. Baumann has written that throughout history, deaf people have developed an exceedingly practical and elegant means of adapting to their surroundings to reflect their unique ways of being. So my interest is exploring those kinds of spatial dynamics at multiple scales, both interpersonally and geographically. Go to the next slide here. Here we go. And I'll begin with an image description of the image on this slide. You'll see a line drawing of two figures. They're walking. One person has raised a hand as if using sign language. Dotted lines encircle the space around the head, arms, and waist of each figure. This is intended to highlight the space in which they would be using sign language. Arrows emphasize the line of sight from one figure to the other's face and hands, emphasizing the visual access within that signing space. So continuing with Bauman's notion of deaf space, we're imagining constructed or temporary arrangements of bodies and furniture and other spatial elements, the ways in which they're arranged to suit deaf sensory abilities. It refers to the way in which deaf people orient themselves in space to enhance their understanding and experience. Bauman has identified sort of three areas: linguistic sensibilities, cognitive sensibilities, and cultural sensibilities. And these are ways in which spatial dynamics highlight are suited to a particular utility within deaf experience. So first, in terms of linguistic sensibilities, this is about access to signing space, so the way that deaf people position themselves in a room and toward one another to ensure visual access to communication, sight lines for maintaining eye contact, and also spatial awareness of who's in the room, who's entered the room, who's entering the room. Influence of lighting, for instance, on the perception of sign language and communication within a space. There's also cognitive sensibilities. This gets at this notion of sort of wayfinding in a space. As a person enters a space, how do they make sense of what other rooms, spaces are attached within that place? Sensory reach. Someone who is hearing, for instance, can hear the sound of footfalls, heels on the flooring outside of their room, have an awareness that someone is about to enter. This sensory reach is shifted if one's sensory experience is different. So think about the ways that deaf people will orient themselves in space using things like reflective surfaces, so they're aware of people entering the room behind them, aware of the space around them. The use of tactile vibration to gain attention, to solicit attention. And finally, cultural sensibilities, the ways in which spaces are modified to reinforce collectivism, for gathering, for communal experience. The ways in which they extend the sensory threshold, identifying areas of privacy and spaces that are public for communication that's visual. So these features of deaf space raise an interesting question for me. What about access and ownership of deaf space? So cultural historians, or cultural studies scholars Carol Patton and Tom Humphreys have written that deaf communities have always relied on borrowed spaces or buildings controlled by others, even as deaf people owned some of their own buildings. An awareness of deaf spatial access, an awareness of deaf spatial practice raises questions of access and ownership. As scholars Carol Patton and Tom Humphreys have acknowledged, the majority of spaces inhabited by deaf people, their places of work, of learning, many of their homes, are under the control or influence of others. More often, deaf people gather in spaces which are designed and maintained by hearing people. Or, as Patton and Humphreys explain, there is no obvious place for the lives of deaf people. Meeting places are transitory and temporary. Keeping these ideas in mind, my question then becomes, what are examples, historical examples, of deaf spaces? How do we trace both permanent and temporary deaf spaces in the past? So for me, digital mapping is a tool for visualizing these spaces at a greater scale. In addition to a close reading of sources for spatial dynamics utilized by deaf people, mapping permits me to understand deaf space across time and place. Sites of gathering become data points which are combined to offer new insights on deaf placemaking. The first instance that I'll consider here is Deaf Spaces, Deaf Residential Schools. This slide features an image which I'll describe. This is a lithographic picture of a classroom setting. At the front of the room, a male instructor stands on a raised platform with a chalkboard behind him. His arms are raised in sign language. In front of him, male and female students are seated at 3 rows of desks. At the back, some students are standing. Their eyes are trained forward, watching the instructor. Now, residential deaf schools are often identified as epicenters for deaf communities. This is largely due to the immersive nature of deaf experience in these spaces. Deaf students arrive with different sensory abilities, different exposure to language, a diverse set of social and cultural skills obtained in their homes and communities. In residential deaf schools, scholars have acknowledged that deaf students underwent a very rapid process of sign language acquisition, of cultural exposure and socialization, in addition to academic learning experiences. Now, I argue that these spaces also honed deaf spatial practices through the interchange of students and faculty at deaf residential schools. Through classrooms and dorm rooms, people developed particular sensibilities about the use of space and adopted social practices to support and sustain deaf ways of being. In this image, for instance, we see the instructor on a raised platform. This ensures visual access for seated students in the room. We see them all arranged with their torsos turned toward the speaker, maintaining visual access to not only their signing space, but their own, if they were to raise their hands. We see here implemented the use of large windows, for instance. Prior to the spread of electricity in these spaces, having good lighting in classrooms would have been crucial to the transmission of learning opportunities for students in sign language. There are a number of other examples here, but I'll move on to the next step for this, was just to think about this at a greater scale. Mapping deaf residential schools from 1817 to 1880. Here I'm depicting a map of the United States appended with blue circles. The circles are closely clustered in New England and then spread through the South and Midwest. The West is sparse with circles in Oregon, California, and Colorado. The majority of these circles appear east of Nebraska and Kansas. The earliest permanent residential deaf school in the United States is the American School for the Deaf, which was formed in 1817 in Connecticut. And in rapid succession, in the roughly first 60 years, 45 schools are formed to serve deaf students in the United States. The American School for the Deaf was a model for which subsequent educational institutions established structure and curriculum across the country. Initial observations of maps of deaf residential schools highlights the way in which this growth of educational opportunity coincided with the expansion of the United States at this period. As the map here demonstrates, schools are predominantly established in the eastern half of the United States. They're mostly in larger cities. For the most part, states had a single school. Notable examples or outliers would be places like New York, Pennsylvania. The map offers some insight on the geographic distribution of deaf children. It also offers some insight on the locations of educated deaf people through about 1880. While deaf people relocated after leaving school, the map depicts the distribution of permanent gathering sites for deaf people in the United States. Next, I want to shift to another type of gathering: deaf spaces, deaf conferences. Here I have several images. I'll give a quick description. The images are of the front pages of several primary sources. The front page of the newspaper, the Deaf Mute's Journal, the front page of the deaf publication, The Deaf Mute's Friend, the proceedings of the fourth Convention of American Instructors of the Deaf and Dumb, and the 43rd Annual Report of the Board of Trustees and Officers of the Ohio Institution. Beginning in the mid-19th century, deaf adults began to organize into regional and national social organizations, forming large-scale public events for gathering. These conferences and conventions are loosely categorized into three types: alumni events, For instance, the Alumni Association of the High Class of the New York Institution, which first met in 1859, or the Ohio Alumni Association, which first gathered in 1870. There are social and political organizations, like the New England Gallaudet Association, which organized in 1853, or the Empire State Association, which is the New York Association of the Deaf, which formed in 1865. And then there were also meetings of educators and administrators for residential deaf schools, things like the Convention of American Instructors of the Deaf, which first met in 1850, or the Conference of Principals in American Institutions of the Deaf and Dumb, which first met in 1868. Now, these events were often open to the public. They were attended by both deaf and hearing people. Proceedings were usually conducted in sign language, and some large events utilized interpreters. And by interpreters, I don't mean the types of interpreters we have here today, but community members who volunteered to serve as interpreters during those sessions. So taken collectively, these meetings form spaces of significant discourse by and for deaf people. Taking a look at them, mapping deaf conference sites between 1850, which would have been the first, to 1880, early period of deaf regional and national organization. And I have a map here that I'll describe. It's a map of the United States, which is appended with red circles. The circles are closely clustered in New England and the upper Midwest. There are no circles west of the Mississippi, and only 2 appear below the Mason-Dixon line in DC and Virginia, respectively. So mapping conference and meeting sites then from 1850 to 1880 visualizes temporary gathering sites. During this period, 44 events were held. These events were largely in borrowed spaces, city halls, rented rooms, and other buildings. They were organized by local deaf community members who would bring to those meetings an awareness of local social spatial practices. And for the duration of the event, the visibility of deaf people and sign language increased in these spaces as the population of deaf people suddenly rose. And that notion is informed by anthropologist Hildy Howland, who's looked at deaf gathering in the 20th century and 21st century at large-scale deaf events like the Deaf Olympics. In her work, The 2-Week Village, she explores how, for a temporary period, when these events take place, suddenly cities become deaf spaces. Because deaf people are spread throughout that space and because the population suddenly increases, something very interesting happens there. So this is offering some insight on these ideas happening in the mid-19th century, which I find very interesting. In this case, this map initially reveals that the majority of the events held during this period took place in New England and the upper Midwest. In the map, you'll see that some of the circles are slightly darker in shade. This is to indicate multiple events occurring at that place. So here, and a notable example here would be in Ohio. We have a very dark circle in Ohio. This represents the Ohio Alumni Association, which met biannually or triannually at the Ohio institution. And finally, I'll get to my specific focus, which is on deaf spaces, deaf missions. Here I have an image, a lithographic picture of a church setting. At the front of the room, a male instructor stands in front of a pulpit on a raised platform, the chancel behind him. His arms are raised in sign language. In front of him, male and female congregants are seated at 3 rows of pews. Their eyes are trained forward, watching the sermon. At the same time that deaf organizations are formed, the Protestant Episcopal Deaf Ministry greatly expanded in the United States. The ministry was begun in the 1850s by Reverend Thomas Gallaudet, the first son of Thomas Gallaudet, founder of the American School for the Deaf. And in this image, he is the person depicted in the pulpit. Now, through Gallaudet's labors, a group of deaf ministers was ordained in the church from the 1870s onward. And additionally, deaf lay readers conducted provisional services and Bible study across the U.S. in mission sites. Worship services were conducted in sign language. Clergy engaged in advocacy and support to community members across these locales. And they formed local gathering spaces that were conceived of as part of a national community, a national religious community, a national deaf religious community. And just quickly here again, I'll talk about the spatial elements that are visible in this image. So we see Gallaudet pictured here giving a sermon in front of the pulpit on a raised platform, and seated in front of him are congregants who, again, bodies are turned to face him, their signing space visible to his signing space. Another thing I'd like to note is in the background, in the chancel, we do see a baptismal font. It's a sort of circular object, which has sign language depicted on it. It's another fascinating thing as I came across as I was studying church spaces is how many of these deaf churches utilized sign language and deaf representation within the context of the church. Sort of another feature of deaf placemaking that's visible. So let's start to map this idea a little bit. Deaf spaces, deaf missions, mapping mission sites. From 1850 to 1880, here I have a map of the United States, which is appended with gray circles. The circles are closely clustered in New England, the upper Midwest, and southern states. There are no circles west of Nebraska, that period. So considering the mission sites of the Protestant Episcopal Deaf Ministry, it's important to note that there are relatively few spaces which were constructed or renovated for use by deaf people. Rather, hundreds of meeting spaces were provisionally reorganized for temporary services. In total, from 1850 to 1880, I've been able to identify 748 separate mission sites which were utilized by deaf congregants and clergy. These spaces were organized with varying degrees of regularity. So some of them met weekly in a church space. So a place like St. Anne's Church in New York or All Souls Church in Pennsylvania would have had weekly meetings. And then other mission sites, they may have visited once, ever. Another site they may have visited twice a year. So there's a great deal of disparity. The majority of this mission existed through itinerant services. So a missionary like Austin Mann would travel across 10 states over the course of a year, offering irregular services to various communities. Someone like Job Turner, who traveled in the South, often would just put a notice in the newspaper, I'll be in this town and I'll show up and give a sermon, come on down. So there's a lot of disparity between these mission sites in general. As with the previous maps, the visualization of deaf sacred worship spaces conveys information about the geographic distribution of deaf people at this period. Many of the meeting sites are in major cities. The pattern of distribution, as with residential schools and conferences, seems to favor the Northeast. But more significant questions can be asked about this kind of data. And the way to get at it is to start putting these maps and these findings in conversation with one another by layering them. So this is mapping deaf spaces, the image description for this map. This is a map of the United States zoomed in on the Midwest and East Coast. The map is appended with gray, red, and orange circles. The gray circles are closely clustered in New England, the Midwest, and southern states. There are no circles west of Nebraska. Orange circles are closely clustered in New England, spread out in the South and Midwest. Red circles are closely clustered in New England and the upper Midwest. There are no red circles west of the Mississippi, and 2 appear below the Mason-Dixon line in Washington, D.C. and Virginia, respectively. So this just combines the 3 previous maps that we've looked at. So what we're doing here is putting the data sets in conversation, and that uncovers some additional insights on the spatial practices of the deaf community. Layering them reveals the various types of organizations or organizing spaces that deaf people had available to them. As we've already seen, most of them are in the Northeast, which is interesting. And there is overlap in meeting spaces. If I'm able to zoom in on each of these and see whether or not they are really overlapping. And my initial assumption when undertaking this project was that I would see a mission site with a close relationship with a deaf residential school, because deaf residential schools are so important within the deaf community. However, in mapping them, I did not find that to be the case, which led me to then pursue a map on conference sites. I thought, great, perhaps what happens is they gather for a conference, they have a service, they think, great, we can do this again, and then that becomes a mission site. And what I found through digital mapping, and was borne out through the reports that I worked through, is that's also not the case. That also doesn't seem to be the reason why a mission site formed where a mission site formed. So this leads to bigger questions, right? So this is part of my research practice here, was to put these things together and then to begin asking questions and asking questions and asking questions. So in order to answer that question, I realized that I needed another form of data. And so what's visible here now on the map is the same map that I previously described is now appended with gray lines that seemingly connect the majority of these dots together. Using spatial data on railway routes revealed alternative insights on the growth of the mission. Systems of transportation appear to have been the stimulus to the organization of new mission sites across the period. As signing clergy used trains to travel between these locations, cities along rail routes appear to have become hubs for temporary or permanent gathering of deaf community members. So this map offers perspective on some of those spatial practices. And for me, it served as a real reminder of the way that a greater context influenced the formation of deaf spaces. It wasn't initially a consideration to me to think about transportation, but this made it abundantly clear that that should have been one of the first things that I considered. So taken together, mapping and close reading have really offered me insight on deaf spatial practice at scale, both interpersonally, but then also looking at this as a sort of a national question. And I'm going to wrap up here with some comments here on digital mapping and accessibility. For me, digital mapping is both a research tool and a presentation tool. As I hope I demonstrated here at the end, as part of my research process, I learned a lot because of the visualization that I obtained through mapping. Most people encounter visualizations as presentation tools, as a complete finished product. And I think data visualization is useful because it helps you to get at these questions of scale. It helps to reveal patterns. Oftentimes they can be interactive. And they present complex, layered data and spatial information simultaneously. So there's a real utility there. And while I think data visualization has implications for making deaf and disability communities more visible, it has also created new challenges for studying and teaching about the past. In many cases, the design and function of visualizations makes the messages embedded in them inaccessible. Creators often take for granted that their users will have visual access to the lessons that they're gleaning from those visualizations. Digital maps and other visualizations should be guided by the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. Those are published by the Web Accessibility Initiative of the World Wide Web Consortium, which forms an international standard for the internet. And so sort of the key pieces to, for instance, digital mapping that you want to keep in mind when you're building something is that mapping should have a purpose. It shouldn't just be there to be pretty. It should have a meaningful impact on what you are trying to present. You want to combine maps, and this is what I've done in my work, with argument, with text-based descriptions and alt attributes that make the meaning embedded in that visualization accessible. You want to make sure that the map controls can be meaningfully labeled, that they are operated without a mouse. And finally, that you want to make sure that visualization information can be conveyed with attention to color perception. So using shading or shapes and symbols and finding other solutions to present information in alternative ways so that it's accessible. Sort of important considerations to keep in mind. I would say that digital humanities is a growing field, so there's a lot of room for growth and improvement. But if you're interested in these subjects, I would love to talk to you some more now in our Q&A.